So I have read some of or the occasional Jane Austen novel previously, but I never really paid very much attention to them. And within the past couple of years, I thought I will just sit down and read all of them. And I did. And I really, really enjoyed myself. And I have thoughts about the other ones as well, obviously. But I was thinking about Sense and Sensibility because during this latest, or that read, I didn't particularly enjoy Sense and Sensibility, or I thought it was a bit boring, or it was just not one of my favorites. So recently I've been reading about Jane Austen's novels and her work online. And I started thinking, you know what? A lot of other people really like Sense and Sensibility. I should read it again. I should give it another try. I mean, it's funny because, say what you want about that 95 version of Sense and Sensibility, with Hugh Grant and Kate Winslet, but I really liked that movie for some reason as a kid. So yeah, I was like, you know what? So I should reread the book. So the reasons why I didn't really like it initially, I think the reasons why I didn't really like it initially is because, and you are free to say that I am stupid and wrong for saying this, but I felt like the side characters didn't leave as much of an imprint on me, because there are these side characters in some of the other books that are just so memorable and seem so much like somebody that you would meet, or they're so likable or so hateable or so interesting or whatever. And I felt like that was missing a little bit from Sense and Sensibility. I find the whole, there's two sisters, and the older one is super mature and responsible, and the younger one is super stupid for no reason. And I'm not saying that this happens in Sense and Sensibility, but I feel like it's a trope that I see in a lot of other books, and oftentimes the younger sibling is just so stupid and obnoxious and a careless jerk for no reason. And then the older sibling is like rescuing them, and I'm just like, I don't really like that. And so I didn't really like the silly, overly sensitive younger sister trope thing that was happening. So those were like some minor issues. And then my major issue is the fact that like the main guy, Edward, I don't like him. He's boring. He's he's just boring and kind of lame and doesn't really seem to have that strong of a character. And I also feel like we don't really get to see the development of his and Eleanor's relationship. Like, I feel like we are told, like the reader is told by Eleanor, oh my God, I've said like so many times. The reader is told by Eleanor that she loves him and thinks he's so amazing. And as a reader, I feel that, okay, that's great. Can we have some evidence, or why do you think he's so amazing? And I really should write this down before I start talking, but the thing is of course, you find out later on that he's kept this engagement that he doesn't want to keep because it's the honorable thing to do. And that's part of why Eleanor is, loves him so much, thinks he's so amazing. And I'm a little bit like, okay, sure, it's the honorable thing to do, but there were ways to get out of that. Or like, couldn't you just be honest that you don't like this person anymore? And like I understand that, Lucy was in a very tentative position, so he didn't want to do that to her and that sort of thing. But then it's like, then it's silly anyway, because he loses his inheritance anyway and doesn't have enough to marry on anyway, so he's not really helping her at all by marrying her. It's just, the conversation always goes, well, oh, poor Lucy, it was so hard for her, and Edward was so honorable. And I'm like, to me, it just speaks to a certain degree of spinelessness, which I cannot abide by, that you would be willing to completely fuck up the rest of your life just for your own personal sense of honor. I understand it was a different time, but that Edward just doesn't impress me. Like there are other contexts in which that behavior would impress me, and I think actually that's part of what gets missed in Mansfield Park and some of the other discussions of some of the other guys, is that it was dishonorable. It was a really shitty thing to do, to flirt with a woman and toy with her affections and make her think that you were going to marry her, that sort of thing, because it was obviously a much bigger deal back then. I get it. I get why Lucy does what she does. However, to me, Edward should have had more of a spine, and he should have figured something out instead of just being like, well, I guess I'll just suffer miserably for the rest of my life because I won't say anything about it. It's just, he's very unappealing to me. So there's that issue. And also, the two main characters who are supposed to be falling in love, they interact so little throughout the novel. So that combined, so the main pair interacts very little, combined with the fact that I felt like on this first reading, I felt like it was missing interesting side and background characters, just made it not particularly interesting to me. And I felt like Marianne was sick for so long. And I felt like they were just in town and Marianne was pouting about Willoughby for so long, for so much of the novel. So I didn't really like that either. And finally, I always try not to think about this sort of thing, but it is like, it is also a little weird because like Colonel Brandon is a decent guy, right? And we get to see the appeal of him, but we get to see the appeal of him in his interactions with Eleanor. We basically never get to see him interact with Marianne. He doesn't really interact with Marianne. He just like loves her from afar, is obsessed with her because she's so pretty and so like his dead lady love or whatever. And I'm like, it's just not really appealing, I would almost buy the romance or the relationship between Colonel Brandon and Eleanor more than I do between Colonel Brandon and Marianne. And like, let's just set aside the whole thing where he's like, old enough to be your father, basically. And she, everybody decided that she should be his reward. Like, I know it was a different time. I know that one still makes me cringe slightly in a way that Edmund and Fanny in Mansfield Park, I'm like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, but let's set that aside for the moment and have my main complaint be about that the romantic pairings do not spend that much time together interacting on the page, which made it less interesting for me. And also, like I said, I felt like there were less interesting side and background characters. So, that aside, I really should have written this down because now this is going to be super duper long and rambly for no reason. On second reading, going in with a different mindset, also because I had read a lot about Mansfield Park. A lot of people say It's their least favorite. They think it's super boring. They don't like it. They don't like Fanny. They don't like Edmund. They don't like them together. Blah, 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 blah. And then I read Mansfield Park and I loved it. And my main thing that I have to say about Mansfield Park is I think people go into Mansfield Park expecting this big romance with a capital R, like Pride and Prejudice or like Persuasion, like those are, I mean, in different ways. All of her novels are so different. It's amazing. Anyway, but Pride and Prejudice, it is a romance. It's an amazing romance, and the main characters interact so much and they play off each other in such a fascinating, enjoyable to read way. Anyway, so I think people go into Mansfield Park expecting a romance, and it's really about all this other stuff. It's about Fanny and her journey. It's about families. It's about, it's about all of this other stuff. And romance is not really what the book is about. So I went into Sense and Sensibility with a different mindset this time. I'm like, maybe I didn't like it because I was expecting romance, and it wasn't really about that. And so if you read it more as, an exploration of their family relationships, and looking at like what is the best way to act and think when it comes to the balance of sense and sensibility, of course the title, all that sort of thing. And it's really interesting to compare different characters to each other. Then I enjoyed it a whole lot more. And the other thing is that I thought, I don't really know what I was thinking the last time I read it, because there are some great side characters, or at least there are some great villains, because the villains in the villains in Sense and Sensibility are so evil and so hateable. Like books like Persuasion, there isn't really a villain. Books like Pride and Prejudice, there isn't really a villain. Like there are some people who sort of cause problems, right? But there's no one that is like actively working against the protagonist and, is her rival and is being a jerk for the sake of it. Like in Mansfield Park, I guess the only villain, somebody who's being, okay, I'm probably not using this word correctly, but in Mansfield Park, the only person that is directly and actively a jerk to Fanny just to be a jerk is Mrs. Norris. Everybody else has like shades of gray and complications and that sort of thing. And that's another thing I have to say about Mansfield Park and Mary. Like, I don't think Mary is not really a villain at all. So anyway, that aside. So then in Sense and Sensibility, to watch Lucy, who she is so evil, like, and she had to because it was the time. Sure, but there were so many times that she would just be a jerk, or just try and stab Eleanor just to try and get a reaction out of her, this sort of thing. And of course, the Dashwoods, they're just terrible. Oh my God, they're terrible. Obviously the John and Fanny Dashwood. Like, God, they suck. And Edward's brother, he also sucks. And it's just like, and Lucy is so evil. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I completely was ignoring this, I guess, the first time around, that there's all these fun, conniving, evil people to read about. So I also enjoyed it so much more the next time around based on that. And also looking at, who embodies sense and who embodies sensibility. Because somebody was talking about, Lucy could be seen as embodying sense to an extreme degree. Like everything she does is for the logic of it and like how it's going to advance her life, and nothing about feelings. Like she has no feelings for Edward, and she probably has no feelings for Robert either. It's only sense. Whereas, you know, yeah, Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood are, of course, more about sensibility, but those are always juxtaposed. Whereas, yeah, it was just very interesting to read more into what the evil characters are doing, because it's way more interesting if you read from that point of view. Okay, so now I've talked about that enough, and I wanted to read a couple of the things that stuck with me. Oh, also, I mean, Jane is always making commentary on relationships of different kinds, but I feel like there's two pretty interesting, there's John and Fanny Dashwood, who arguably make each other worse. And then there's also Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, who are weird, to say the least. And Eleanor has some commentary, or not Eleanor, actually the narrative voice has some commentary about Mr. Palmer and his kind of desire to think himself superior to everyone, and that's why he was unhappy all the time. And, his wife doesn't think herself superior to everyone, and she is happy, almost like to spite Mr. Palmer. I don't know. It's interesting. I feel like I watched a YouTube video essay about it, and I cannot find this YouTube video essay. So if anybody knows what I'm talking about, then please let me know. Oh, and Lady Middleton and her awful children. It's just like, and that's the other funny thing, the thing that is so funny to me when I'm reading Jane Austen's books, and I'm like, people say exactly that, and they treat children exactly like that, like right now, today. Oh, I'm sure it's a mutual enjoyment. And the kid is just acting horrendously. It's so funny. It is so funny. Anyway, I wrote down page 137, lol. The young ladies went, and Lady Middleton was happily preserved from the frightful solitude which had threatened her. The insipidity of the meeting was exactly such as Eleanor had expected. It produced not one novelty of thought or expression, and nothing could be less interesting than the whole of their discourse, both in the dining parlor and the drawing room. And I'm just like, hasn't everyone experienced some kind of social gathering where you're like, oh, this is going to be so stupid and a waste of time? And then it produces exactly as much insipidity I'm not sure how you say that, as one expects. So I like that. And of course there are so many funny little jabs between Lady Middleton and Lucy and Eleanor. That's the other thing that bothers me. I mean, it's like, this is not just a problem of ye olden days. I have 100% been in modern real life situations where somebody is doing their darndest to ingratiate themselves with somebody else who, has more money or has more status or whatever. And then if the person falls for it, I'm like, oh my God, are you really that fucking stupid? Because like everybody else can tell that, they're bullshitting you. I don't know. It's just, oh yeah, all the side characters are actually so annoying when you think about it in Sense and Sensibility. And also character descriptions like, Lady Middleton was equally pleased with Mrs. Dashwood, meaning Fanny Dashwood. There was a kind of cold-hearted selfishness on both sides, which mutually attracted them, and they sympathized with each other in an insipid propriety of demeanor and a general want of understanding. It's just so mean. And yet, like, I've encountered people who, it's like, oh, this person is a sanctimonious, selfish prick. And sometimes you see them meet another sanctimonious, selfish prick, And it's like they recognize each other. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess that's been happening for a long time. And then the scene where they are comparing the heights of the little boys of Lady Middleton and Mrs. Dashwood. Lucy, who was hardly less anxious to please one parent than the other, thought the boys were both remarkably tall for their age, and could not conceive that there could be the smallest difference in the world between them. And Miss Steele, with yet greater address, gave it as fast as she could in favor of each. Eleanor, having once delivered her opinion on William's side, by which they offended Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny still more, did not see the necessity of enforcing it by any further assertion. And Marianne, when called on for hers, offended them all by declaring that she had no opinion to give, as she had never thought about it. And I love this bit because and they get so offended later on by this, and Marianne's just like, I don't know, I've never fucking thought about it. Like, that's so stupid. Basically. And it's like, because it is. And people are still like that. Oh my God, people are still like that. So that's the other thing. This reading, I loved Marianne so much more. I paid a lot more attention to the characters and how they are. And I really, really loved Marianne. Which actually, that's another note. I don't really like that towards the end, Marianne has this magical realization that she has been so overly, too much sensibility, and she has been silly, and oh, now she will be serious now because her illness has, made her grow up, put the fear of God in her, basically. And I'm like, okay, I mean, I get it. Like, we do grow up and that sort of thing, but it just feels a little bit more moralizing, a little bit more of a fable. Like, well, you see, she was very silly, and then she got sick, and then she matured. It just feels more like, I mean, it is one of Jane Austen's earliest novels, or is it the earliest one? And I can just tell, or I feel like it's kind of influenced by the sort of more moral novels of the day in that particular way, which is kind of funny later on because she does make the point of saying that Willoughby was not unhappy. Like, readers of a novel might be like, oh, but he should be punished by the narrative, and he isn't really. And, none of the villains are punished by the narrative. But yeah, I don't know. There were just slightly more lines in Sense and Sensibility that was like, Marianne learned her lesson, that don't come up in her later works. I'm not really sure if I'm wording this correctly, but yeah. I really, really liked Marianne so much more on the second reading. And I actually enjoyed Eleanor more on the second reading too, because I was paying more attention to what she was doing and what she was thinking, instead of thinking okay, when are we going to get some interaction with the, guy again? Obviously, there are many, many more things to note. But one thing I did note, I always like things that are relatable, right? So though nothing could be more polite than Lady Middleton's behavior to Eleanor and Marianne, she really did not like them at all, because they neither flattered herself nor her children. She could not believe them good-natured, and because they were fond of reading, she fancied them satirical, perhaps without knowing really what it was to be satirical, but that did not signify. It was censure in common use and easily given. And I feel like this is something that shows up today, that people will seek to surround themselves with people who flatter them. I don't mean in general, but there is a certain type of person who will do this. And then if you are not willing to play their semantic games in conversation and are not willing to demonstrate enough that you share their beliefs and you're not willing to flatter them, then they don't want anything to do with you. So I just find that interesting. Oh, and speaking of self-improvement, because I do love to consume self-improvement content, and I have loved to do so since I was a teenager, so more than 10 years at this point. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was like, it's a long story, but I had told him, I'd gotten up at 6 and I'd already gone climbing and, done some work, and I was going for a walk and this, that, and the other thing. And he was like, oh, you're living like the Google CEO lifestyle. And I was like, am I, or am I living the lifestyle of an Austen heroine? And I sent him a picture of this page where Marianne talks about all the walks that they are going to go on and the ruins that they're going to go to and the research she's going to do. And then she says, I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean, never to be later in rising than 6. And from that time until dinner, I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I have formed my plan, and I am determined to enter on a course of serious study. Our own library is too well known to me to be resorted to for anything beyond mere amusement, but there are many works well worth reading at the park, and there are others of more modern production which I know I can borrow of Colonel Brandon. By reading only 6 hours a day, I shall gain in the course of a 12-month a great deal of instruction which I now feel myself to want. And I'm like, you know what? How many times in my life have I made an extremely similar plan for what I will be doing during the summer holidays? And it's just so funny to me. So I really enjoyed it on second reading. And it has definitely gone up my list as far as ones that I like. So I will have to reread the other novels with fresh eyes, I suppose. I did just reread Persuasion this summer, because I was on sailboats for most of the summer and I felt it was appropriate.